Welcome to AM Best Audio.
The Florida Insurance Roundup podcast from Lisa Miller and Associates is the podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. It's the only podcast devoted exclusively to Florida insurance issues, including the latest developments in property and casualty, healthcare, workers' compensation, litigation, and surplus lines insurance from the Sunshine State. I'm John Weber for Best Review Magazine, and my guest today is Lisa Miller. Lisa, so glad you could join us today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Lisa, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, that's a great journey and a great starting point. I started in state government in the mid-'80s, right out of college at FSU. What happens when you go to FSU and you land in Tallahassee, sometimes we never leave, and there's many stories about that of those that were in that same space. It's a beautiful place to live. And spent 10 or 11 years in state government. I ended my career as a deputy chief financial officer to our state's chief financial officer. And one of my most proud achievements was when we kicked off the My Safe Florida Home program in 2005, right after those terrible storms in 04 and 05. And back then it wasn't cool to talk about resiliency or mitigation. And I remember testifying in front of the Florida cabinet and telling those cabinet officials that it was my goal that the word mitigation would be as cool as Starbucks, or just anything that would just roll off someone's tongue. And that when they went to a cocktail party, they'd be talking about their new impact windows and the straps they put on their roofs. And to this day, Florida's leading the nation, along with Alabama and a couple of other states, in trying to let people know that, yes, you can replace your granite countertops, but you might want to look at replacing your windows and your roofs and making your homes more resilient. So that's been a hallmark of my career. I left state government in 2007, and I opened my own consulting firm. And I'm privileged to represent and consult with about 10 or so Florida property insurance companies. We have 8 million homeowners policies in that neighborhood in Florida, and I represent companies that write 25 to 30% of those. And when I say represent, it's a privilege to talk to the leaders of these companies who some have been in business for 20 years. You've seen some recently that are going to try to go public. It's been an interesting ride. So thank you for that question. And it's a privilege to work in this state and alongside some of the smartest people that I've ever known in the insurance industry.
So let's talk a little bit about your podcast. What was the impetus for that, Lisa?
Back in the mid-2000s, 16, 17, I was noticing I was spending an awful lot of time educating individually legislators and regulators, insurance professionals that were much younger than I was. And they just kind of want to understand because, I've been in this over 30 years. And so, I remember the days of when mitigation credits came on the books in Florida. And sometimes they were so high, insurance companies would print renewal notices and they would owe the customer money because they were so high. I remember those days. And, just those days, I was around during Hurricane Andrew in 1993, and I would talk about being a facilitative regulator. And I just kept saying the same things over and over again because one of the things that I have in my DNA is that it's never about me or my firm. It's about everyone else understanding what this industry is and what it means to helping people, rebuild their lives. So I have an incredible producer who has been in the TV news business and reached out to him and said, can you help me do a better job to educate the masses? Can you help me not have to say the same thing 12 times a week when I could interview someone? And he goes, because that's when podcasts were really, I think they had really become popular a few years before we started ours in, the mid 2000s. And so it was awesome. And our first podcast was about a woman who had been wronged by a roofer. And it was back in the days when the roofers were really kind of running roughshod against particularly the elderly. And we called that roofer out, and I'll just never forget the relief that this senior had after telling me her story on our podcast and being able to share, to warn seniors about what they should look out for and not sign paperwork, those kinds of things. So after that, as they say, the rest is history. And I there's so many interesting people in this industry. I talk to engineering firms, I deal with realtors, construction contractors. I could just go on and on about the incredible guests that I've had. And it really is a labor of love. Not only do I do a podcast in my firm, but I do a newsletter every 2 weeks, just full of information. And we do one every week during the legislative session. And, so we have close to almost 20,000 viewers and listeners. And it's just grown over the years. And my favorite story was when I was in an airport and someone walked up to me and said, "Are you Lisa Miller?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I get your newsletter every 2 weeks and it's the only one that I read." And I said, "Well, how do you get it?" He goes, "Oh, it's forwarded to me from somebody else." So I really don't know how many people listen to it, but I've started this animal and I got to keep going and I love it.
And how many episodes have you recorded, Lisa? And what are some of the subject matters pieces that you tackle?
We've done 57 of them. One of my favorites is a developer named Marshall Gaboudi, and we had Marshall on with also a representative from the Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is an incredible organization, of course, that leads the resilience science effort to show which products are more resilient in roofs and windows and all those kinds of things. And also a very innovative engineer, Scott Lidwell, who owns a company that has an innovative building product that doesn't burn. Insects don't eat it, and it doesn't flood. Imagine if that product had been in all those homes in California. And that was one of my favorite episodes because Mr. Gaboudi, the developer, has a development down in Cortez, Florida. And if you look at the survival rate of those homes and how well they did because he built them resiliency, it's fascinating. Those are the kinds of stories that I love to do so people can understand that we have to take responsibility in our great state with all the storms that we know are coming, and they're going to come. I had recently a gentleman in his 80s, and he was the leader of the largest workers' comp company in the state. And he shared some of his legislative experiences that were very similar to what we're going through in the property insurance industry. So, I mean, it runs the gamut. And I have people that reach out to me that want to do the podcast with me. And then I have others that I pursue because I think it'll be of interest. And it really isn't anything strategic or I have a game plan. I just might be in a coffee shop and listening to something, and it'll hit me that might be an interesting podcast. So for any of you that are listening, if you feel like you've got a story to tell, I'm a pretty good interviewer and enjoy working with folks like AM Best and others who love to use the podcast method to educate audiences.
Customize your data experience. BestLink now offers an interactive company dashboard that provides company-level intelligence in a fast, user-friendly interface featuring interactive tables, charts, and Sparkline performance histories. Customize the dashboard tiles to prioritize the insurer ratings, data, and analytics that best support your workflow. AM Best. Our insight, your advantage.
So obviously you have guests on a regular basis, but they're not necessarily just people from the insurance industry, I take it. But usually the bent is on insurance.
It is. I thought about venturing out because if you think about it, everything leads to insurance, right? Everything that we do, whether we drive a car, own a home, have a business, drive a boat, it's just all roads lead to insurance. And so there's always a way to have an angle on insurance. But what I find is that the responses that I get from those that listen to the podcast are, "You've opened my eyes," or "I never thought about that perspective," or "This is something I want to hear more about. Can you do a sequel?" I have some pretty devoted listeners, and I take their feedback very seriously.
So let's talk about those devoted listeners. Who are you finding your listeners to be, Lisa?
Reinsurers around the world. That just fascinates me when I receive an email from Bermuda or London that they've listened to my podcast. construction contractors that, there are many that want to figure out a way to make homes more resilient. The last thing they want to do is build a house they know is going to blow down. I have realtor leaders that want to know what's going on, particularly in the commercial residential space. We've got a real crisis in Florida right now with our condo market sliding because no one's buying condos with insurance prices and the assessment fees. Of course, elected officials listen to it. That's probably my most proud moment, because if you think about it, most elected officials don't have the time or inclination to study, really understand all that's involved in the property insurance arena, from reinsurance to, how the agents produce the policies, to what a coverage A is, or, what it means to buy content, none of that stuff. And so that's really, makes me very happy to know that I've got some legislators and others, even county commissioners, that get questions from their constituents and their residents about, tell me about this property insurance thing. In fact, I did a podcast yesterday with friends of mine, not my own, but on another podcast. And the question was, what's the number one thing people can do as we enter storm season? And my first recommendation is that you call your insurance agent once a year. It's like having an annual physical. Call your insurance agent once a year. Talk about your insurance policy. Understand what's in it, what it doesn't cover, which is probably more important than anything, and take the time to get to know your agent that you're paying a commission. It was a fun time.
That's a pretty important question to answer. So what are some of the big questions that you are hoping to answer for your listeners?
I want to talk about in some of the future podcasts, what is the future of property insurance? We've often heard that agents are going to be a fixture on the wall. They're not going to be agents anymore, and consumers are going to buy everything online, and we're not going to need agents anymore. And I don't agree with that. I mean, I'm old school, and my 30-year-old nephew does everything he wants to online. And then I'll ask him a question about his policy, and he has no clue. And so I'll say, well, if you had an agent, because, you got to call, in his world, you got to call a 1-800 number or chat bot. It's just not the same. And so I am a fierce advocate for agents. I represent the Professional Insurance Agents of Florida. It's a wonderful organization. I spend my time with probably 10 agents every 2 weeks from Pensacola to Miami, finding out what's going on in the marketplace. What are their phone calls like? I remember 3 years ago sitting in agent offices around the state, listening to people crying on the phone that can't afford their premiums. What are we going to do? I was banging on the legislature with other colleagues of mine in the lobby corps, telling legislators we've got to do something and get these rates down because of these crazy litigation and all these crazy, roof claims and that type thing. So that's one of the questions I want to explore. Another question I want to explore is, I'm a big fan of the admitted market. I believe in surplus lines, and of course we have our residual markets, and I believe that there's a place for all three. I come from the old school that admitted market first, surplus lines second, and residual after that. And what I'm seeing is that my good friends in the surplus lines profession, their premiums are going up, up, up. And it makes me wonder, is that a threat to the admitted market? Where is this market going? And how do we balance the admitted versus the surplus lines? There's a place for both, as you know. They both have their swim lanes. So I want to explore that. What is the future of admitted, players and products versus the surplus lines? And are people moving to surplus lines because regulations are tough? And yes, they are. But is that a reason for our markets to move in the surplus lines direction? So I'd love to study that. And finally, I guess my last piece is, what can we do to get people to buy flood insurance? What are we going to do? There was a study that just came out 2 days ago by Rethought, which is a private flood insurance company. And they studied the Ohio River Valley flooding. And their study was not surprising. 32% of all the homes in the X zones flooded. It's such a misnomer that we, as FEMA, and FEMA tells people they live in a zone that will never flood. My motto is, if your driver's license says Florida, you're going to flood. Period. End of discussion. And Kevin Guthrie, who is the most incredible emergency manager in the entire country, we are lucky to have him here in Florida. His top 3 issues, flood is among those. And what can we do to get people to buy flood insurance, particularly if they live in an X zone when it's $1,000 a year, because their homes are going to flood. And so those are 3 main issues I'd like to explore going forward.
So, Lisa, what's the future of plans for your podcast?
I will continue it as long as I have listeners that find it valuable. I've got ideas of what we can do in the next 6 months, 2 to 3 years, wherever this thing goes. I'm curious with all the new technology out there with podcasts, would the interest in podcast wane? I hope not. I think it's a great way to just have a conversation, which I believe is better than any email or text message. I come from the old school that every problem is solved over a cup of coffee at a diner in a downtown small town, restaurant. So I see the future of the Florida Insurance Roundup is very bright. And again, I repeat, for any of those of you that have an interest in telling your story or have a topic you think is interesting, I'd be happy to host you.
I love that philosophy. Every problem is solved at a diner over a cup of coffee. Lisa Miller, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
That was Lisa Miller of the Florida Insurance Roundup, and I'm John Weber for Best Review Magazine.
Looking to get the full attention of the insurance industry? We have the platforms that will do just that. Whether it be AM Best TV, AM Best Audio, Best Review Magazine, or Best Day. Find out more by calling AM Best Advertising Sales at 908-439-2200, extension 5399, and have a great day.